It's so good to see all of you. One thing that I want to highlight really quickly before we get out into tonight's event is two numbers. One is 154, and the other is 36. The 154 is the number of programs that the Jefferson Educational Society offered all of 2024. Thank you. And that's really in large part thanks to all of you for coming to our events, participating in our events, and being here. And that's, of course, thanks to our partners in the community, like tonight's partner that I'll talk more about in a moment, but really the Hagen History Center. And what of all of our top attended programs last year, Cal, I think the 4 programs we did together were in the top 5, if not the top 4. So we really do believe in the power of partnerships, and it's so great to be able to work with community organizations to share the load and to lighten the lift. The 36 is how many programs we have lined up for you over the course of the next 2 months. We have events happening here. We have events happening at our 4 satellite locations. We have another off-campus event in which we're partnering with Gannon University and a host of other community organizations to introduce a program on the history and music of Florence Price, bringing in Grammy Award Michelle Kahn to perform with the Erie Philharmonic. So really the power of partnerships also lift up that programming. So 36 programs are going to happen over the course of the next 2 months. We'll see you at some 30 more that come. A big thanks to our team and the team of the Hagen History Center, because if you've watched the news, you know that these have not been quiet times. And you know that if you've seen the local news, that we've made a change here tonight. Previously, we had scheduled Dr. Rod Phillips to present the wine industry of North America. Dr. Phillips is a Canadian teaching in Canada, and you know that something happened over the weekend and then, of course, continued to evolve over the week. But we understand his decision to postpone that and to not make that travel at this time. We are so grateful to be blessed with rich and deep talent here in our community, and again, the power of partnerships to work together to make sure that the show does very much go on. And so we really owe a debt of gratitude for Bob Green stepping up tonight, stepping in so that we can all still gather. And of course, a big thanks to Bob Mazza and all of Mazza Vineyards for being with us tonight for the wine tasting. I don't know about you, but I do feel like in these days, I do kind of need a glass of wine from time to time. So a big thanks to them for being here, and our caterer, Betsy, for also being here. So now that I've gone through the throat clearing to get us started, a couple of things to bear in mind. First, I'm going to ask you in joining me in taking out your mobile devices and placing them in silent mode or airplane mode, or simply turning them off out of courtesy for tonight's presenter, as well as your fellow patrons. Also, too, as you came through, because you're such a large audience tonight, we want to get through as many audience questions as we can. Our team likely offered you an index card and a golf pencil. If you didn't get one of those, just raise your hand. One of our team members will come around. They'll also come around mid-event to offer those again and to collect any questions where you may have written something on one of those index cards. We're going to get those to our moderator, who will be Mr. Kyle Pfeiffer tonight, who does an excellent job at these. So that he can read your question and ask your question. We are asking for great penmanship. So jot down anything that's coming to your mind. We'll make sure that we get through as many as we can. Folks, we do have more upcoming events, which I telegraphed a little bit earlier. We'll be right back here tomorrow night. Tomorrow night's a special program for us because it is the graduation of the 2024 JES Civic Leadership Academy. Now, part of that graduation ceremony is that they present on their research. And we gave them a tall order to examine research and come up with practical recommendations dealing with the topic of mental health. It's a critical topic and a wicked issue that we need people to be looking at and finding solutions for. They'll unpack some of those findings and have access to their full report, thanks to our team for vetting and editing that. That'll be available as well as a website. That's at 6 p.m. tomorrow. Two, you might remember that we've had great success with our community conversation series. That is back, and we start our first one on Friday. Brandon Wiley, the CEO of Open Dives, will be talking about culturally conscious conversations and the impact to have. And I think that's an important discussion to have these days. How do we talk to each other, and how do we listen to each other, and how do we find more ways to unite us than potentially divide us? That's at noon. Those events are free, but if you'd like a lunch, one, you could bring your own. Two, you can give us $5 and we'll get one for you. So you can register for those and all the other events at our website, jeserie.org. And if you didn't get a term brochure, you can be added to our mailing list to see one of our helpful team members. There are also copies in the lobby. So we are looking forward to that. And of course, one of the things that powers the JES is membership. And so I'd invite you, if it is that time of the year, to renew your membership. Please do consider doing so. If you've not yet joined as a member, talk to somebody who is. In fact, who are JES members? Can you raise your hand if you're a JES member? Great. If your hand's not raised and you're curious and somebody you know raised their hand, see them afterwards, why they're a member, why it matters to them, and why that's an important part of who they are in our civic climate. So I encourage you to join. I want to thank our entire team under the leadership and direction of our president, Dr. Furky Faradi, and of course our board of trustees for empowering and encouraging the work we do. And again, a huge thanks to the entire team for the Hagen History Center for helping us move beyond planning to pivot to plan again, and yet again embarking on the journey with us in 2025 to have their Doris Becker lecture series here at the Jefferson Educational Society, something that we've seen such great success with. And I think that's because we both as organizations remain committed to fostering a dialogue where people who may not see eye to eye can gather shoulder to shoulder and be here. So to offer tonight's official introduction and welcome, please join me in welcoming the director of the Hagen History Center to the stage, Mr. Caleb Pfeiffer.
Thanks, Ben. It's so great to see so many of you making it out this winter for our kickoff lecture for not only the winter term for the Jefferson, but the initial 2025 Doris Becker lecture. We pick topics that relate to Erie in some broad fashion. So if we didn't have an amazing wine region, we wouldn't be doing this lecture. Our spring lecture is going to focus on the Trinity of American architecture. Henry Hobbs Richardson, Louis Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright, because we always make sure that one of our 4 lectures focuses in some way on Frank Lloyd Wright's. And then in the summertime, we're going to have a very unique lecture on the Erie accent. There is such a thing. We're bringing in a scholar from Philadelphia who wrote his PhD dissertation on the Erie accent. I want to echo some of what Ben said, the power of collaboration. Thank the Jefferson team, certainly thank our team at the History Center, particularly Pam Parker for not only bringing the series together, but sort of going in the triage mode for tonight. It almost didn't happen. I was walking across the frozen Presque Isle Bay, the wind blowing in one ear, trying to talk to Pam in the other ear on the cell phone, figuring out what do we do. And it would be sacrilege not to do a lecture on wine. So she said, well, who do you know? I said, well, there's only one person I know in the community. We haven't talked with each other since we both left Mercyhurst University, but his name is Bob Green. Let me see if I can get in touch. So just a huge thank you to Bob for his willingness to do this lecture. When it comes to being a regional expert, there's few that are on par with Bob. 40 years of experience as a winemaker, as a lecturer. He was the chief winemaker for Prescal Cellars, ran our viniculture program at Mercyhurst University, and now is a lecturer for Penn State. I think you'll be interested in what he has to say, and then we're going to follow up with the Q&A where I think we're going to be drinking some wine at it. So without further ado, Bob Green.
So good evening. So I was, in kind of thinking about this as Cal was talking, and I looked at this sign over here, and it said the Jefferson Educational Society, Erie's Think Tank. So as a winemaker, the word tank caught my mind. And I thought, how many times have I found myself inside the tank on short notice at a winery? So, but I am actually very happy to be here, and I thank Cal for contacting me and reaching out. I was sitting on the couch, and my phone dinged, and I looked, and it's like, a message from Cal Pfeiffer. Wow. And so I answered it, and he said, would you be willing to do this? And I'm like, sure. Send me the information. This was Monday night. And then on Wednesday, I get this thing and it says, it's Wednesday. And I'm like, wow, okay, yeah, I'll do it. So here I am. And thank you all for coming out. So I'm calling this A History of Wine because it's my understanding that history is kind of written by the person who observes it. And so this is not the history of wine because it is not the end-all of wine history, I'm sure. It's kind of the way I look at it. So this is a history of wine, and it's kind of the way I see it and the way I think about wine in general. And also we'll look at it, this timeline of how it got from the Caucasus Mountains to here, which is kind of a fascinating story and a long journey that goes many places. So, but the other thing is, one thing I learned when I was teaching in the college was, and I still do it actually, is you have to start at the beginning. And you have to make sure that everybody understands what it is that you're talking about. So we're talking about wine. And so my question is, what is wine? And I think a way to answer this question is maybe to look at wine from the perspective of maybe how it came about. Why do we as humans have wine in our daily life in some cases, or at least have it in our culture? And so I thought, well, where does wine start? And the more I thought about it, and by the way, this is backed up also with some scholarly material, but you can go back a few thousands of years, 6,000 years, 8,000 years maybe, and we're talking about really hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers kind of moved around. They would go and they needed food, they knew they could get it from here, and so they'd go there and get it. And my theory is that this particular group of hunter-gatherers knew that if they went at a certain time of the year, when maybe that particular grass over there went to seed, they walked up that hill to the halfway up the mountain. There were some vines that grew against a tree. And so they would go and they would go to the vines at that particular time, and lo and behold, they could get the fruit off of it. And the fruit was really good. It was incredibly sweet, but it had a nice little tang balance to it. So they thought, this is really great stuff. And the other thing that they knew was that these grapes only showed up at a particular time of the year. They all came to ripeness at the same time, then they were gone. So their timing had to be exact. So they made the trek up the hill, they got there, and everything was cool. The grapes were great. They picked as many as they could. They ate as many as they could. And then what did they do with the rest of them? Well, they had these clay pots they used, so they just threw them in the clay pots, and they kept eating them. But they noticed maybe at a certain point that there were some fruit flies flying around these clay pots. Right? How many of you have seen fruit flies flying around a glass of wine in the dead of winter, right? Yeah. All right, so fruit flies show up, and they notice that there's a little bit of juice at the bottom of the clay pots. It tastes pretty good. So they keep eating, they keep drinking, and then they notice that the juice gets a little bit different. It gets kind of tingly in the mouth, and it doesn't taste quite as sweet anymore. So what's happening? Fermentation, right? All right, so now wine is being made, whether they know it or not. And so being the group of people that they are, they're not going to throw anything away because they work so hard to get it, and they know they're not going to get it till next year. So what do? They keep drinking it, and they keep eating them until they get to the point where the grapes are kind of goo, so they throw them aside. The juice at the bottom is really good. And they also kind of notice that when people drink this juice, yes, right? Things get a little bit different, okay? So intoxication happens right away. And they kind of go, wow, this is cool. And we can extend this a few thousand years into the future and realize that this is probably the basis for the religious use of alcohol. So it has, and wine, it has a very important aspect of our culture in that way because it does change us, all right? So what is wine? We can come back to that. It is the fermented product of grape juice or grapes, pretty much only that. And there's even a reason why grapes are the only one. We'll get into that here a little bit. But in the meantime, we can say that wine is a full circle that's interrupted. And you can say, well, all right, where does that come from? So let's think about this. Grapevines grow in dirt. They take water up through, they take nutrients out of the dirt supports them. They grow in dirt, and then they make fruit. All right, so sunlight comes in, fruit ripens, and people pick the grapes. They make juice. Juice then ferments. So if you think back to that scenario that I gave you of the hunter-gatherers, and let's put this in a different context. You go to the grocery store and you buy a jug of orange juice and you put it in your refrigerator and you open it up and you pour some out and you put it in the refrigerator and someone comes in and pushes it clear way to the back and puts something big in front of it and you forget about it. And then you go and you open the refrigerator one day and you move something, you go, ooh, look at that orange juice back there. And the carton that used to be a square carton is now round, right? So what's happening? Fermentation. And do we get excited and go, wow, we're making wine? No, we go, oh man, it's spoiled, and we throw it away. Okay? So that's the first part here of this circle. So we start at the bottom, fruit. It starts to spoil. This is actually, fermentation is a form of spoilage. We've learned how to keep it from becoming spoilage, maybe at this point by saying, if we keep air away from that product, that fermentation, so it ferments, the alcohol is produced, carbon dioxide is given off, that's what made the orange carton round. Carbon dioxide goes away, we now have wine. And if we stop at that point, we have wine. But what happens to wine if we don't keep air away from it? Turns to vinegar, right? So we'll put vinegar over here on this side. All right, so wine then goes into vinegar. And once you've got vinegar, that's really spoiled wine, right? Unless you're making a salad or making pickles, and then you go, oh man, I need some vinegar because we like the flavor of it. So again, spoilage wine, we got spoilage of grape juice, spoilage of wine makes vinegar. What happens to vinegar when it goes bad? It turns into basically two things, water and dirt. In other words, you get a little bit of sediment, it's basically just dirt, so it's a circle. And what we have learned as humans, and we winemakers, is this thing down here at the bottom, the intentionality. Is that our intent when we make wine is to stop that spoilage process at the point that it is wine. And we've learned how to keep it there and hold it there so it no longer goes into spoilage and doesn't just go back into that full circle. So this is what wine is, okay? I think it's a very workable definition. I like it that way because it means, okay, we can stop it, and if we can keep it there, it'll last a long time, which is really kind of cool. So let's look at some other qualities of wine. And these are getting a little more technical, maybe into some wine chemistry a little bit and a few other things, some grapevine physiology, if you will. But basically, it has stability and it has flavor, all right? So this is kind of an interesting topic, I think, also. And right now I'm teaching at Penn State a sensory evaluation course, and it is my absolute favorite course to teach because we get to explore these different aspects of it, mostly the blue circles, not the yellow ones, those are grapevines. But what we're talking about with wine is that kind of that full circle. When we get to wine, if we keep air away from it, that product is basically very stable, all right? So things don't grow in it, so it doesn't have microbial spoilage, which is really what turns vinegar or wine into vinegar is the bacteria, the acetobacter or vinegar bacteria in the contact with air will create vinegar. So we avoid the air and that keeps that from happening. So the first little circle up there in the corner says sugar. And it's interesting when you start looking at the wine or the chemistry of the actual grape itself, is that it is one of the few fruits that actually stores sugar as a fermentable sugar, as opposed to a starch or some other type of sugar that's not fermentable. So the interesting thing then is that sugar content is almost readily fermentable. So if you go back to the hunter-gatherers, they picked the fruit as soon as there was juice in that clay pot, then it started to ferment on its own. The one thing I don't have up here is that yeast also come prepackaged with the grapes themselves. So on the outside of the grape, there's like that little film, and that little film contains all kinds of different species of yeasts. Now here's the catch. Those species that exist on the outside of the grape really don't tolerate alcohol too much, and so they tend to start a fermentation. They have as part of their metabolic process, they give off all kinds of interesting flavors. But they then die because the alcohol content gets too high. And so there's sugar left, which is not really what we're looking for yet. And so what happens next then is yeast from outside come in, and that would be Saccharomyces. So the very common wine yeast, Saccharomyces. It tends to live on things like oak trees. All right, and so one of the early things that people figured out was grapevines grow really well. If you put them next to a tree, it goes up, they like to spread around, and so then you get all kinds of interesting things happening, and the grapes actually grow better. But that yeast comes in, it's a natural yeast, it finds its way in there, and actually if we were to do a culture of our hands in this tabletop, we'd probably find yeast everywhere anyway. So the stuff's all around, but the right species comes in, it finishes it off to completion. So it tolerates alcohol, it chews up the sugar, spits out the alcohol, gets rid of the carbon dioxide, and now you've got wine that doesn't have sugar. There are other spoilage organisms that also need to have sugar. And so by having fermentation and the yeast doing that for us, we kind of eliminate that whole series of microbial infestations that can give us some really bad products. So from a standpoint of flavor, having enough sugar like that gives us a high enough alcohol that it protects it, and it also eliminates any sugar that would feed other organisms. So this is all part of this big plan then to make good wine. So sugar ferments into alcohol. And one of the cool things about wine, and it's a little bit different even than beer or cider, is that the alcohol content is generally 11 to 16% or something like that. If you go out to California, much higher than what you'll see around here for many reasons, but mostly it's sugar content. And alcohol also has the effect of inhibiting different microbes, so it stabilizes the product. So now we have no sugar, we've got alcohol, and that helps to create a very stable product that doesn't necessarily go into vinegar that quick. The other aspect of that is that the acid that is predominant in grapes is tartaric acid. And there's only a few other fruits that actually have tartaric as the dominant acid. The best thing about that is that tartaric is not metabolized or not broken down by any organisms. So it is basically antimicrobial in that way. So we now have sugar that ferments readily into alcohol. We have acid that doesn't break down, which means that it keeps the wine at a low pH, which also has an antimicrobial effect. So one of the other good things about wine that I kind of haven't talked about is that there is nothing that can grow in alcohol or in wine that is toxic to humans, that can kill humans. So there are no pathogens that grow or survive in wine. So that's a function of alcohol and also the tartaric acid that maintains that low pH. So what does this mean kind of on the grand scale? Over time, wine is a very consistent product. It's easy to make. And as long as we follow one very basic tenet, and that is keep it away from air, wine will last for a long time. So let's go back to that hunter-gatherer. Once they figured that out, they took their clay pots and maybe instead of just like laying the lid on top of them, what they did was they took some, I don't know, pine pitch or honey, let's say beeswax is probably better, melted it down, put it on the lid, set that lid on top of it, and sealed it up. And then they could carry these things around if they kept them the right size, and they could drink wine that tasted like wine until the next harvest. So it was a natural way of preserving a crop that was easy to do and also gave a good product in the end. So of course, over time, we've really kind of advanced our understanding of that process, and we do all kinds of things now as a way to make the best wine possible. And so that is the winemaker's job. But the winemaker really has an easy time because grapes come prepackaged, ready to do that for us. So if you think about this over time, then this is a product that we've been able to do for a long time, and it's become an integral part of our culture. Let's go on the other side here, because I've got stability, so we've talked a lot about stability, all right? So wine is a stable product. I also have varietal typicity, all right? So those are some fun words. Varietal means the cultivar or the variety of grape. So examples would be Chardonnay, Riesling, Cabernet Franc, Leon Mio. There's about 5,000 different ones, literally. I mean, there's a book on it if you want to go through and read about them all. But there's a lot of these different varieties, and the cool thing about them is they don't all taste the same. So if you go to, like the grocery store even, and you pick up a package of grapes, they have a flavor. If you pick up a different package of grapes, they might be a little bit different, right? So that's varietal flavor. So changes in variety. If you go to the wine shop and you buy wine and start tasting different varieties, obviously some big differences. So why do we have that varietal typicity? And so typicity, if you just think of like typicalness, all right? So this is the typicalness of the variety. In other words, that flavor profile. The first thing is that grapes at some point, and this, they actually feel like it is very much tied in with when we settled down as humans and actually started planting vines, because the bisexuality, there was a single gene in most cases that flipped, and it went from being monosexuality. In other words, you had a male plant and a female plant, and in order to get grapes, you had to have the pollination of the female plant. Well, with bisexuality, everything's combined into one flower, so it pollinates itself. And what that means is that it stays true to the genotype. So you no longer get, like, if we think about our kids, for example, you look at my children, I have two boys, And my wife is sitting in the audience, and she looks like she has her physical features, and I have my physical features, and our kids share that. So we can kind of pick out, yeah, well, you've got your nose, and you've got your ears definitely, and different things like that. If we were like a grapevine, we wouldn't need that. We could just have, like, my kids would look like me. Sorry, I'm glad it doesn't work out that way in some ways, So this gene, when it flipped, it was just a mutation, and suddenly grapevines, at least the ones that they were using, were able to carry these same flavors from crop to crop to crop. So in order to preserve that, they use vegetative propagation. All right, so that's a kind of a fancy term for basically they take a piece of the root, the vine, they stick it in the ground, it roots and it grows. Okay, it's like a clonal selection in a certain way. So they're taking a piece of the vine and they grow it and they grow it and they grow it. So grapevines then are grown in that way. We don't grow them from seeds. So when you go out in the vineyard and you see little grapevines, it's because somewhere in the nursery they have taken cuttings, they have rooted them, and they have prepared them to go in the ground. There's no cross-pollination between plants in that case. The other interesting thing about that is, this type of mutation occurs pretty commonly in grapes to a degree. And certain varieties like Pinot Noir is known to mutate on a whim. So if you're familiar with Pinot Noir, it's a red grape, right? Makes a red wine. And there's also Pinot Gris, which if you look at the grapes, they're actually copper colored. And then there's Pinot Blanc, which is, of course, the white Pinot. Pinot Noir is the black Pinot. Pinot Blanc's the white. Pinot Gris is the gray in the middle. So it's like a continuum of color. You can get white grapes, these kind of copper-colored grapes, and sometimes you get a little bit of color in the wine from that. And Pinot Noir, which is a red grape, they're all mutations of Pinot Noir. And so something in there flipped the gene, and instead of being purple, it came out green. That's all. So this is what we try to avoid, but it also gives us some interesting options we can say, just in terms of flavor, right? So this whole varietal typicity is kind of convenient because we can then plant Cabernet Sauvignon and we can harvest Cabernet Sauvignon for a long time from those vines, and it's not going to change, right? So these are some of the reasons why grapes, again, have lent themselves to kind of the seriousness and the depth of endeavor that people have put into them to make sure that they grow. All right, so to kind of put this into perspective then, and this is kind of the archaeological record, and as I was reading through material, kind of boning up on some material for this, one thing I noticed was this date here, I have 6,000 to 5,000 before the Christian era. In the Caucasus region, which is between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, kind of the current country of Georgia, north of Turkey, kind of in that little area there. This is where they feel like that grapevines as we know them, the Vitis vinifera, the European wine grape, started there. And, you'll see references to other places, and maybe it was 8,000 years ago. That's 8,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or something. It kind of depends on who you're reading and what their take on it is. But in any case, that's a long time ago. I know, I look at it and go, yeah, that's 6,000 years, whether it's 8,000 years, 6,000 years, doesn't really matter. It's a long time ago. But they have found in pottery shards a calcium tartrate. All right, so there's that tartrate showing up again. It's a very stable acid, and so it just kind of shows up. It doesn't go away, little bits of it, and they go, aha, those are grapes. Because there's probably not another fruit that had that same acid makeup. So it all kind of runs together there. This is where they feel like that the Vitis vinifera, the European wine grape, originally started from. Once we started realizing the benefits of it and creating vineyards, they started moving around with it. And of course, it went down south to the Mediterranean. And once it was in the Mediterranean, it dispersed along northern Africa and also into Greece. And so now And, we're talking 2300 BCE instead of 5,000 years ago. So it's taken its time, several thousand years. And then once it got to Greece, they moved it up into Rome, into Italy. And of course, when the Romans then expanded their empire into most of Europe, it kind of got pushed up into that. So now we have the grapevines that originated in the Caucasus region, down through the Mediterranean, up into Western Europe. From Western Europe, of course, it then goes into the New World, which is where we are. And you kind of look at like the time starts out really wide and then it compresses down. And as we kind of look at what happens next, things get really compressed. But the next step then, of course, would be to go to the New World, which is where we are, right? So this is the United States. It's part of the New World. And we can define the New World versus the Old World in wine terms anyway, as the Old World is basically Europe. Our understanding, our cultural relationship to wine as we know it is a European thing, right? So the wine flavors, even the names, if you look at them, most of them have like a French, Italian, German, something like that name. And then we start moving into the New World, which includes the United States, but we can also say any of the colonies of Europe in the past, so last several hundred years. So South Africa, South America, Australia, New Zealand, those all become part of the New World, right? One thing about the Europeans, when they went into a new world, like to go into, like the United States, for example, the people came over and they didn't really come over like tourists to experience the colonies. They came over to take them over and make them theirs. And so they came in with their culture and they brought with them their culture. And so in the New World then, wine is introduced as that European concept. Now, you can say, well, the United States is a big country, it's a big region, and it extends down into Mexico and up into Canada and whatever. I mean, those boundaries didn't exist at that time, so where do you go from there? Well, as it turns out, there are a few native varieties or species of grapes that were already present in the United States or the New World, at least North America, we should say. About 34, in fact, altogether, that can be kind of easily cataloged at this point. Now, I have up there native on the top, and Vitis labrusca is one of them. And Vitis labrusca is probably best known as, like, I think Concord is a good example of that type of grape. Concord is probably a hybrid, to be honest, and it has some Vitis vinifera background in it, but for the most part, it does include this like native species of Vitis labrusca. It's very common. If you look at a map where it occurs naturally, it's most of the East Coast over to like central part of the country and down somewhere to maybe South Carolina or North Carolina, all right, up into Maine and Canada. So pretty common on the eastern, northeastern United States where we are at this point. There's also Vitis estivalis and Vitis rupestris and a few other. Vitis riparia comes in there. There's a whole list of them, like I say, 34 different species if you want to get into it. And they're spread out in little pockets around the country. Most of them, the grapes, like we have wild vines around here and they have these tiny little grapes on them. And I don't know if any of you have tried eating them or not, but I have. And first of all, remember that little reference I made to the sugar being adequate? They don't have much sugar, believe me. And that how important tartaric acid is, and they've got a lot of tartaric acid, or malic acid maybe also, but they're really sour, okay? So talk about sour grapes, that's about it. So we don't want to get into them too much, but there is a point, and it's kind of a different lecture, I think, than this one, but this has to do with, well, we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but that's all right, we'll come back. One of the things when there was trade going back and forth between the United States and Europe, we sent some grapevines. We were so happy with our grapevines. We sent them back and unknowingly sent back a nice pest for the vineyard that killed a bunch of vines, like most of European vines. was killed by the root louse. And so one of we'll say the cures for that was to take American rootstock, because the root louse, hence the name, attacks the root and damages the vine and eventually kills it. So we can take an American rootstock and we can graft it onto the scion wood, or the nice Merlot that makes really good wine. So we use these up here. Is it dead? No, there it is. We use these as rootstocks to actually kind of grow the European vines. So that's northeastern United States. On the other side of the equation, we have Vitis rotundifolia. And how many of you have had muscadine grapes? Anybody? Okay. Yeah, a few of you. They're grown down south. It's the native grape of like southeastern U.S. You find them in, Florida, for example. We'll see that here in a minute. But also like South Carolina, North Carolina, we have muscadines. They're very different. In some cases, they grow like cherries on the vine, so they're not a cluster fruit. And they have a really tough skin. They have a very distinct flavor. We can say like the Labrusca varieties, like Concord and Niagara, have a very distinct flavor. So do the muscadines. And much like we have kind of a fondness for grapes around here, the local grapes to eat because they remind us of our kids, same thing down there. But if you switch those kids around, they're going to go, this is weird. These don't taste right, because the flavor's a little bit different. In terms of wine, it has its following, but it doesn't quite work out in the way that we experience wine or know wine to be. So it doesn't fit that European model of wine. So it's kind of dismissed, we can say, a little bit. But it's one of the native varieties, or native species, actually, that shows up here. We also have Vitis mustanagensis, which is the Mustang grape. And not surprising, that one is found pretty much in Texas, a little Louisiana, kind of in that general area down there, maybe the Mississippi Delta region. It has also been used in terms of hybridization by some of the Texas people. And so it has some significance, but not too much. All right. So all this to say that when they came to the New World, they brought their vines with them, and they also found here a whole bunch of grapevines on their own. So in other words, for once they came and it's like, wow, this is really cool. We've got some other things to work with. What they found, though, is that the flavors were not quite to their liking. So they weren't real pleased with it. Let me go back for a second. So if you look, Vitis vinifera, then, this is the European grape. And I have the European grape because it is almost the only one that you'll find in Europe. So whereas we have multiple species, they have but one. And that's the one that they make wine from. Okay, moving ahead. So now we've come from we're back to Europe. We're importing grapes in, and the original people that came in, so this would be the Spanish, I think it was Cortez, sent some people over to this area. They landed in Florida, and they went and kind of set up a settlement somewhere around St. Augustine. And in doing so, they noticed that there were grapes grown kind of in the Jacksonville area. Jacksonville didn't exist, but kind of that general geographic area. They were the Vitis rotundifolia, so those were muscadines. And they made wine out of them, and it was wine, okay, so it was okay, I guess. What they noticed, though, was that Florida at that time was pretty much uninhabitable, because you think like Disney World didn't exist, for one thing. The beaches were probably nice, but so were the mosquitoes and the alligators, and the swamps were all over the place because they hadn't drained them yet. So all in all, Florida wasn't like the vacation spot we think of it here. All right, so it kind of didn't go anywhere. All right. Let's go on to the next one. Let's go on to this one. How's that look? And is that the right? Yes, okay. So the northeast coast. So in other words, kind of up in our area now. And this is in the 16 to 1700s, so we're spanning about 200 years with this. A lot of settlers came over, a lot of people came from the New World, or the Old World, into the New World. They brought with them grapevines, they planted them, and they grew. And they were all excited about it. And then 2 years, 3 years later, they all died. Or they get really scraggly, they'd stop producing fruit. So what was happening was a combination of things, and mostly it can be brought down to disease and insect pests. And so one of the insect pests was the one that I just mentioned, which was the root louse, also known as phylloxera. So phylloxera, it attacks, it's a root louse, and it attacks the root, pierces it, pulls moisture out, so it lives off the root. In doing so, it takes all the goodies that go up to the vine, so the vine kind of withers up. So this, these vinifera that they planted, they would get excited, they would grow, but then they would die. So they never really got a good crop off of them. But they kept trying because they wanted to do this. At the same time, though, because there were so many other grapes around, they were able to use those, and they were actually able to make decent wine out of them, at least wine that was palatable. The flavor wasn't the same, and I'm sure that as they sat down, to dinner with their Vitis Labrusca or their Vitis Estivalis wine, they kind of said, oh, I wish this was better. I just remember my Merlot or my Bordeaux. It's more likely that I got when I was in France, and it was so much better. But we're happy to be here and have this. So this is kind of the way it went until about the 1770s. And then there was a pathway that came from Spain up through Mexico and Central America into the American Southwest as we know it now, San Diego basically. And they brought with them mission grapes. And these were Vitis vinifera from Spain. They brought them along, they planted them at missions outside of San Diego, and they grew. And because there were not particularly grapes in that area already, these vines survived. The climate was good, it was dry, it was hot. And so for the first time, we were able to have grapes that actually came from Europe survive enough to keep going. They weren't the best quality, mission grapes weren't the best, but they still worked. So for the first time, we actually move into something that is pretty decent. So about the same time, let's go back to the 1790s and back to the East Coast. And we have this variety called Alexander. And it was named after the gardener of William Penn's son. At his house, they had vines planted because during that 1700s, just in general, there was a lot of pressure on people to plant grapes and try grapes and get to grow grapes to try to make wine because it was being viewed as a desirable product. All right, we wanted to be able to make wine. And actually, Thomas Jefferson was one of the big proponents of this. And he pushed hard through the late 1700s into the 1800s to get people to grow grapes and to make wine out of them. He saw it along with, I think, the first 5 presidents. They all kind of got together and they said, wine would be better for this country than other things like whiskey because it's much more civilized and we would see less problems if we had wine instead of whiskey on the table. But anyway, there was this vine, and we feel like, or we kind of sense that it was an unintended cross between a Vitis labrusca, so one of those native species, and one of the Vitis vinifera that they were planting. So if we go back a little bit to what I was talking about, the bisexuality, you can, like the grapevine will propagate itself or fertilize itself, but you can also go in with a little paintbrush and go like that on the flowers. Grapes have flowers, and you can cross-pollinate and create hybrids and crosses that way. So in some way, this vine got crossed between a vinifera and a labrusca variety, and the grape that came out of it just so happened to have qualities that actually worked, mostly disease resistance and pest resistance, and also good flavor. This grape was recognized as being one of the best grapes so far that they had growing that survived and also had good flavor. So it was being pushed out to all the new areas. And again, Jefferson was behind this. He said, this grape is going to be one of the best ones. It is in our interest, and I'm paraphrasing, by the way, to make sure that everybody plants this and we get it out to the states. So it got pushed out, and you can see Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Virginia. These were all kind of the ones identified that the Alexander grape went to. In terms of the importance of it in Pennsylvania, the first commercial vineyard and nursery was down near Philadelphia, and it was the Pennsylvania Vine Company, and this was one of their big varieties, was Alexander. So from the 1790s, once this started happening, at the same time there was more effort being put into creating these crosses between the hybrids and between the vinifera. And so all of a sudden, we see this big jump in terms of the number of grape varieties that are available. And some of them, like these are the ones that were identified kind of early on, mid-1800s. And so if we look right up there, there's Catawba. And if you tasted wine from the Mazes, one of the wines they brought was Catawba. So this grape goes back to our early history in terms of, like, we'll say successful viticulture and successful winemaking. And it's still with us today. It's still widely grown. And it still is, I mean, it's had its moment where it was the most popular grape in the country. It's been grown in Ohio, it's been grown in Missouri, and also New York. It was used as a base for sparkling wines for a long time. So it has like this kind of following, and it's stuck around for a long time. In terms of some of these other ones, Concord, of course, also is one that became very important, especially in our region, and we'll talk about Concord quite a bit here in a little bit. Isabella, another old variety that's been around for a long time. Interestingly enough, this was also the main grape that was used in New Zealand for a long time. So the New Zealand wine industry got its start using Isabella. Some of the other ones, Elvira, still being used, still used as kind of a commodity grape by none other than Gallo. It's grown in this region, also in the Finger Lakes. They take it, they use it out in California and also in New York for some of the big, like, products like cold duck sparkling wine or whatever, the kind of we'll say the classic New York sparkling wine. It would be very typical of that. Salem and Herbert came from a very small, I think it was called the Hardy crosses, and you don't see them around much, but they've had significance over the time, including, especially Salem was one that showed up early on as we're going to grow this grape and make a big deal out of it. Ives still around. There's a winery in New York, Johnson Estate, that still grows Ives, and they're probably the only place I know of it. And it's a very distinct, kind of like Concord on steroids. Very dark color, lots of flavor intensity, and interesting in its own right, we can say. At the same time, we're adding more states to the list. In other words, viticulture, these wine grapes are getting disseminated throughout the country to the new wine growing areas, and they're finding success with them. So Ohio River Valley is a big one, Missouri, also a big area, and now we're probably getting into Michigan as well. So this is a time when, again, like, things are happening in this country in terms of growing things. So here we are, all right? So all of a sudden we're coming from then up to now. Obviously, the key thing here is that right there. And if it were not for Lake Erie, I would not be standing here talking to you, because we would not have a wine industry, and Cal would not have said, hey, can you come talk about history, because we don't have it here. So without the lake, we would not be. And that's very simple and very clear. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do is just go south of Interstate 90, most of Erie, and you won't see a grape anywhere. But as soon as you cross over into the lake shore and the lake plain, you're going to find the grapes. I keep hitting the wrong button here. Okay. There we go. And here's why. We all know about lake effect snows, but those of us in the wine industry know about the lake effect in a different way. And quite simply, it has to do with heat, cold, air patterns. Okay? So Lake Erie, over here on the left, is a big body of water. And in the wintertime, like now, it is a big ice cube. All right? And it's interesting because last year, if you remember what the winter was like and what the lake temperature, the lake never froze, right? It was one of the weird years where it doesn't freeze. A very tangible result of that happened, and I think it was February, or maybe it's actually probably April of this year, of 2024. There was a cold snap. All right, it got down to like 28.5 degrees, and they actually measure it in terms of tenths. And wineries and vineyards that were like east of Westfield, so between Westfield and Silver Creek, New York, the Fredonia, Brockton, Portland, going up that way, all had severe damage to the point where some of them lost all their Concords, right? The buds had pushed out because it was so warm, and they froze when it got that cold. When you get west of Westfield, so into northeast and Harbor Creek, no damage. They had a big crop. So what happened? My theory is that a wind was blowing down from the northeast, and where it came and it missed the lake, it was actually colder, and where it was across the lake, it got warmed up because the lake was warm. So that 1/10 of a degree or 2/10 of a degree was all it needed to keep from damaging the buds here, but fried them over there. So all this to say that this year, I heard so many growers saying, I hope the lake freezes this year. Why? Because it keeps everything cold here. Let's move ahead into April, March maybe. And the lake that was a big ice cube now is no longer an ice cube, but it has floating icebergs on it. Like I remember we used to live on a house that overlooked the lake, and there would be a point in the spring where you could just see like this mass of ice moving down through, and then the wind would blow the other way and you'd see it go back the other way. And so this ice movement and this cold water delays the bud ripening or the bud pushing so that the buds no longer push out so early. So everything stays cold, the grapevines go, man, it's too cold, I'm not going to do anything, and nothing happens. All right, and then finally it warms up, the lake warms up enough, the ground can then warm up because the lake's not so cold, and the buds come out, and at that point we're past the frost state, so we don't have to worry anymore, and everything takes off and goes as normal. All right, so that means that maybe we start out 2 weeks behind other regions in the area because we're so much colder. You know, if you, in even April and sometimes May, if you go to like northeast or go down to the shore and go outside, it's like 40 degrees. You drive south by 3 miles, you cross Interstate 90 and you look at the thermometer on your dashboard and it's 40 degrees or 50 wherever I started. It's 10 degrees warmer. All right, so there's that difference between here and there based on the lake being cold. Now let's jump through the growing season and we get into the fall. We've got this big body of water out here and it's been warm in the summer. The water temperature's heated up. As it heats up, wind rises, goes up the escarpment or up the lake plain here, hits the escarpment, cools off, flows back down. So you've got this constant air rotation of warm air coming off the lake. The effect of that then is when we get into October, everything stays warm and the grapes continue to ripen. We've actually had times where I remember the first frost came in December in Northeast because the lake was that warm and it kept it just 10 degrees. It's a big jump right then. So this is why we have the lake effect. This is why we grow grapes. If you look at this kind of cross section, no grapes right there because you're on the wrong side and the cold air is going to be there. So There is what they call the Lake Erie viticulture area, and it is recognized by the federal government, and it basically extends from the Ohio-Michigan border all the way down through past Cleveland up to Buffalo. And in some places, it is about 3 miles wide right here in Westfield, 3 to 3.5 miles, and that is the distance from the shoreline to the top of the escarpment. And if you're going up 90 right by Westfield, you can see that hill right there, and you can see the water on the other side. So it kind of narrows down. Once you cross into Ohio, of course, everything kind of flattens out. So this area becomes quite large. And this is the AVA, as they know, and it is recognized, again, as a region that has characteristics that define the flavor of the grape. So we can talk about terroir, again, another conversation for a different time. But basically, it is what lends the grapes the flavor based on the climate in which they are grown and the soil conditions. Lake Erie was dug out by a big glacier. When the glacier melted, it dropped a bunch of gravel, sand, and clay, and that's what our soil types are, and that's what also defines this region. So this is the Lake Erie region, and we are focusing on basically from northeast up to Silver Creek, which we call the Concord Grape Belt, or the Grape Belt as it's also known. So that's kind of our region right there that we're talking about. So the early years of that, and we'll pick up a little bit more history here. We can start off, let's see, that's 1824, when some of the first grapes were planted. And there was a guy in Brockton, his name was Deacon Elijah Fay. He was a Methodist, and he wanted to make sacramental wine. So he planted grapes. He started out with Isabella and Catawba. And then in 1830, so finally got the grapes up and running, he was able to make 30 gallons of wine. And it all became sacramental wine. So that was the beginning then of the wine industry in the Grape Belt. A little bit later, this guy by the name of Ephraim Bowl, he was lived up outside of Boston, Massachusetts, in a town called Concord. And he actually had to move out of Boston because he was having health issues. So he bought a place outside, set up a little farm, and got into grape breeding. And at one point, he had 10,000 different cuttings that he had done and vines that he had kind of cross-pollinated with the attempt to find something that could stand up to the cold New England winters and also the humidity, which brought on disease. So he finally came up with the one that he thought was the best. He said it had a robust flavor. It had good qualities. He called it Concord. He tried to sell it for $5 a vine. And ultimately what happened was other people got a hold of it, made cuttings, and said, well, we're not going to pay you anything. So he kind of lost out on it. But his name still lives on. And, Concord is still the grape in the Concord Belt, as we call it, or the grape region. He released it to the public in 1853, and it came to the Lake Erie region a little bit later. So a few years later, it was planted in vineyards. It was praised for its qualities. At the same time, or right around that time, Deacon Fay's son, grandson, and nephew kind of got together and they opened a winery. And it was called the Brockton Wine Cellars in Brockton. And what's interesting about that was after several years, they were at about 37,000 gallons, which is fairly decent for a winery, especially in this area. Some of them are much bigger, some of them not so big. So 37,000 is, I think, a pretty decent size. And it was very successful. And, instead of bottles, they had pottery, like salt glazed pottery jugs with the name kind of scripted into it. And that's how they sold the wine. That was the first winery in the region. Then we go into the South Shore Wine Company. That was in the mid-1860s. It was in Northeast. It still is in Northeast. It still is a wine cellar, although no production takes place there. But if you really want a cool experience, go. Because one of the cool things about this was when they built it, they wanted to emulate the French wine cave. So they thought, well, here's how we're going to do it. They piled up a bunch of dirt. They laid stone over top of it to make an arch. Then they went in and dug all the dirt out. And they had the most beautiful, incredible stone arch that's still in existence, and still you can go in, take the little stairs down into the South Shore Wine Company, which is one of the Mazza properties, and have some really good wines. I suspect they probably had some out there tonight from South Shore. Yeah, good. You know, it's the Mazzas have deep roots, we can say, in this region, and have contributed a lot to it in many ways. You know, they are definitely some of the drivers of the area. Another family that's been a driver, and I will admit I have some bias here because I worked for the Moorheads for 40 years. But that would be the Moorhead family, several generations back from the current family. But they were kind of right on that border between Northeast and Harbor Creek in Moorheadville. They started out with vineyards. They planted some of the first Concords in our area, in the Pennsylvania side, we can say. And they also very heavily got into table grapes. The railroad tracks are close by there. The railroads, there were 5 of them at one time that came through there to service the grape industry, put in a siding so they could load grapes, and they got shipped out to New York City, Philadelphia, East Coast, all over the place. So a lot of these grapes got sent out from the Moorheads and other people, and we'll see how that plays out also. But in terms of like the beginnings of things, this is where it all happens. But, you know, Concord, it is the bane of our existence, and it is why we are here. You know, so if we talk to like wineries, we all kind of go, yeah, we make Concord. But we make a lot of it, and we sell a lot of it. Concord gets shipped out of this region to other regions, wine regions, by the tanker load. From Welch's, from also Growers, which is a Growers Co-op, which is another big juice processing plant in Westfield. So in some ways, Concord can be dismissed as a run-of-the-mill wine, and at the same time, it's our lifeblood. And so we kind of recognize that, and we kind of go, okay, you know, I'll make good Concord, and it's important to make good Concord because you can make bad Concord, and it's not good. But Concord is the variety that you're going to find most. So when you're driving down the road and you see the vines, most of those are Concord. The second variety would be Niagara, which is kind of the white variant of Concord. And then if you look closely, you'll see vines that don't look the same. Oftentimes the leaves are lighter in color and more like vivid green. Those are wine grapes. And so smaller vines as well. So you can kind of tell them apart. But in terms of the Concord, there's really 3 avenues that we had started with in terms of kind of marketing it and growing it. The first one is juice, all right? And this actually comes a little bit later. In the 1870s, the Welch's in New Jersey, in Vineland, New Jersey, want to make a non-fermented wine, as they called it. And the reason was they were teetotalers. This is about the time when temperance started picking up in this country. So they wanted something that they could use as the sacramental wine that was not alcoholic in the church. And one of the things that Dr. Welch did was he started listening to what this guy by the name of Louis Pasteur, you've probably heard of him, started talking about. And one of the things he did, Pasteur, was he realized that, well, first of all, he said, oh yeah, there's yeast in there, that's why things ferment. Prior to that, we didn't know. We just knew that fermentation happened, all right, part of that mystical aspect of wine. So he identified yeast, and then he figured out that if you take a bottle of juice and you heat it up in the bottle, it doesn't ferment. So pasteurization, right? Makes sense. So we all know this is kind of like old stuff. But for Dr. Welch, it was pretty cool, and he said, wow, this is really great. You know, I can take grape juice, I can pasteurize it, I don't know if they had the term for it, but I can make my unfermented wine and sell that as unfermented wine. And we've now sidestepped the issue of having alcohol as a sacrament. So he was in New Jersey. He realized the grapes he really wants are up in Chautauqua County. So he loads everyone up and they head off to Chautauqua County, spend a couple of days at the Institute, which wasn't called the Institute at the time, but it was the Methodist camp. And he said when he was driving down, if you've ever come from like from Mayville down into Westfield, it's like you come kind of along and then there's that big hill and you look out and all you see is the lake and you see the town of Mayville. He said he saw that and he goes to the steeples, the lake, this is where I want to be. And he set up in Portage Street in Westfield his new plant. And so that was in 1896. Of course, Welch's is still there, and it's still pretty much in the same place. The old plant is abandoned at this point. It's been sold, but one of their major processing areas is still in Westfield. There's also one in Northeast and a few others, one out in Washington and Michigan. There used to be some in Arkansas, but they've closed those down. So juice obviously took off. It's successful. It's still successful today, and most of the grapes that you see are processed to go into juice. The fresh market, so these would be table grapes. You know, Concords, I think most of us probably grew up eating Concords, and you know, it's like some people, like everybody slips the skin off, right? And what do you do next? Do you spit everything out or do you swallow it? I mean, I just eat them all, spit the seeds out, but you know, it's like there's a whole ritual of eating Concord grapes. And then you pick up like a Thompson seedless or something at the grocery store and you pop in your mouth and you chew it up and you go, that was good, yeah. But it doesn't have the same like thing that it did like Concords do. But anyway, they start off by selling baskets of grapes. And they even developed a basket that was very particular. So this is back in the 1800s. They sold everything in rail cars. All right, so they were called the Climax base or basket. And Climax because it was like the best basket they came up with. And it had a hard side, like a veneer side to it, and a lid that held on with wires and a handle. And they carefully packed the grapes into it and put the lid on. Then they could stack them up and ship them out in a rail car. And the grapes would arrive unsquished, we can say, at the destination, wherever that might be. So it works out pretty good. So carloads refer to railroad cars. And so in 1897, they had over 4,000. And it kind of peaked in 1914 at 8,400 railroad cars. So let's think about this, all right? How were grapes picked back then? By hand, right? So we typically start Concord harvest, I don't know, right around October 1st. We typically, maybe a week later or a week earlier, sometimes two, but usually 1 week, and then it finishes up by the end of October. So we're looking at a 5 to 6 week window when you're gonna go out and pick 8,400 carloads full of Concord grapes, all right? So a daunting task. I don't know how many of you know, but the Northeast mascot is called the grape picker. So we are the Northeast grape pickers. And it comes from this time. Schools closed during harvest. Kids were expected to go out and did go out and harvest grapes. Nowadays, the guy gets in the picker, the harvester, he drives down the row, he picks 24 tons to go on the semi-truck that goes to the plant in a couple hours. All right, so it's a very different world now. The market ended, though, in 1939 for several reasons, but basically people just quit buying Concords like that, quit shipping them. Part of it was that hybridization was producing seedless grapes now, and that was preferred for the table. Of course, the third avenue is wine, and so that's where we kind of come back to where we're talking about. And so in that post-Brockton Wine Company period, other people jumped in the bandwagon, and we started seeing an increase in the number of wineries. Some were quite successful, some of them maybe not so much. At about the same time, though, we're running into the temperance movement. And so this is leading us up to Prohibition. The growers in our area didn't feel the effects of temperance as much, even though if you go to Westfield, there is a monument to one of the early temperance leaders in the park in Fredonia. But this is all starting out, it of course ends, we can say in 1920, with the passage of the Volstead Act, which introduced Prohibition. So at that point, it was illegal to transport, manufacture. Those are the two biggies of alcohol. And there were a few exceptions which were exploited to a great deal, of course. But we ended up at Prohibition at 1920. So what happened to the wine industry? It got shunted, for the most part, into the juice industry. So the juice industry picks up at that point and kind of takes up the slack. So as a region, as a grape growing region, we were the lucky one because we had this alternate market. Even actually the table grapes worked our way through Prohibition as well. So like I say, we were lucky. We got through that without much damage to the industry, grape growing industry. All right, so time to rebuild some things here. And Prohibition ends in 1933. We have some new varieties that are being increased or being introduced into it. So we've gotten a little bit further with growing. And I have two names up there. One is Dr. Frank, Dr. Constantine Frank. His fame, his current fame, the legacy is Dr. Frank's Winery in Hammondsport, New York, in the Finger Lakes. One of the premier wine growers, one of the premier wineries, one of the premier wine families on the East Coast and probably the nation for that matter. Dr. Frank came from Ukraine. He was born in like the turn of the century. He came from Ukraine when he was quite old. He worked in the Finger Lakes in the grape industry at Gold Seal. He worked at the Cornell's research lab for a while out in the vineyard. Then he started planting grapes. He was pushing only that we should be growing vinifera grapes. No hybrids, no native grapes. He called them toxic. Right? He said, and well, we won't go into the discussion about the pigeons outside the door, but basically the pigeons, the deformed pigeons that he would find for whatever reason, I don't know, he touted them as this is what happens if you drink hybrid wines. So, but on the positive side, he had what he called the cooperators. And the cooperators were people in other regions who he encouraged and worked with and mentored to grow these vinifera grapes, these European wine grapes. And in the Lake Erie region, there are 4 of them that I know of. In Ohio is Arnie Esther, who passed a couple of years ago. He was at Marco Vineyards. John Moorhead was a grower who also has passed. He's in Harbor Creek. Doug Moorhead, who is John's 5th cousin, also in Harbor Creek. Farms are almost adjacent to each other, also passed within a couple of years. And Bob Woodbury, who is in Woodbury Vineyards in New York. They were all what they called cooperators, and they strove to grow the vinifera grapes in the Lake Erie region and succeeded. I will add that. So we have them now, and we can actually do them very well. And the ones that we grow are cool climate, that are more disease resistant, and also have that flavor profile that we're looking for. All right, so Riesling comes to mind, Chardonnay comes to mind, Pinot Noir comes to mind. These are all the vinifera, the classic European wines. Philip Wagner is another guy, and he was the editor of the Baltimore Sun, and he also had Bordy Nursery and Bordy Vineyards in Riderwood, Maryland. And at the time, he was growing American hybrids, French-American hybrids, and pushing those to people. He and Constantine didn't see eye to eye on much, I'm afraid, even though I'm sure they were both wonderful people. But he was growing these hybrids and pushing them out, and in some cases, they actually were what was needed, because they make decent wine in the right hands, and they grow in almost everywhere. All right, so it works out. Again, cool climate, disease resistant, good flavor. That's what we're looking for. On the winery side, once we came out of Prohibition, we had problems because there were some issues with things like laws, all right, for wineries. And in Pennsylvania, the attitude of then Governor Pinchot was, I want alcoholic beverages to be as inconvenient and as expensive as possible for Pennsylvania citizens. And he created the PLCB, all right? New York had maybe a little bit more liberal laws in certain ways, but for winery owners, it was still a very complicated process and not really workable on a small scale. So in both cases, New York and Pennsylvania, there were a group of people who got together and in their own respective states pushed to get winery laws that would favor basically growers to be able to market their fruit as wine. So in Pennsylvania, in 1968, we had the Limited Winery Act. And it was a last-minute effort, hard push by Doug Moorhead, and also the owners of Penn Shore Winery. So there was Luke and McCords and Seifert, three gentlemen who were the owners there, worked with State Representative Bill Slessler, and they got this pushed through and passed into law on midnight of the last day of the session in 1968. So they got it passed through. The law basically said you can sell direct to consumers, you have to use 100% Pennsylvania fruit, and you're limited to 200,000 gallons. All right, so some very basic ones in there. Prior to that, the only way you could sell wine was through the Pennsylvania state store system. So they'd have to sell to the state, then buy it back. Even if you owned the winery, you bought your wine from the state. Penn Shore in Northeast, license number 1. Presque Isle, license number 2. My theory, and again, my bias, is that it was alphabetic. That's the only reason. All right, so Penn Shore comes before Presque Isle, issued on the same day. Who cares? Both wineries are still around. Also, Mazza Vineyards in 1972 became a winery, and of the top, or the first 12 wineries, 5 of them are still in existence. These 3 are 3 of the 5. So we have some of the oldest wineries still in existence in the state happening. On the New York side, in 1976, similar effort. This time it was Fred Johnson, who's in Westfield at Johnson Estate Winery, and Mark Miller, who had Ben Marl Vineyards clear way over in the Hudson Valley. They were the ones that pushed it through, and Mark got license number 1, and Fred got license number 2 for their efforts also. Similar, very similar scenario for both of them. So they were able to get those through in that way. So now we have a workable model for wineries. And if we kind of look at where we are right now, up here we have the Lake Erie wine country. So that is the local wine trail. It spans from Harbor Creek, Pennsylvania to Silver Creek, New York. Over 20 wineries are in the wine trail in Lake Erie wine country. All right, so that's a pretty decent number. We're holding our own. Welch's, still in existence, still buying a lot of grapes. We also have Growers Co-op, which is another grower-owned juice processing plant. They do Concords, they do Niagaras, they do some other fruits, and that's about it. All right, they do a lot of fruit. Refresco used to be Cliff Star, and another big processor of grapes in the area. So these are kind of the major plants. Agri-America is a new one also that is processing a lot of fruit. A lot of it goes to the kosher wine industry. The Grape Discovery Center is in Westfield. It's before you get to Westfield on Route 20. It's basically the retail shop owned by the Lake Erie Concord Grape Belt Association, Heritage Association, and it's worth a stop in if you're out in the area. It has a lot of historical information. The exhibits in the back are great, and it's all grape themed. So that then I think brings us to our current point. And I suspect I should probably not talk anymore and answer some questions, right?
We're going to do it a little bit differently because we're at time, but I do want to follow up from your last slide just as a closing, because this was 2 or 3 people asked a similar question, which is about the wine region today and where it's headed. Reputationally, is our wine region growing? Is it growing at the pace as others? It was very interesting when Rod Phillips was supposed to come. Rod's gone all over the world to these different wine regions, some very obscure. And he hadn't come here, and what really surprised him when he started to research our wine region, he goes, "Do you know that Pennsylvania is the 7th largest wine producing state in the nation?" So, well, we had a wine program at Mercier, so I did know that, but it's a lot of people find that surprising. It's a robust industry. So maybe just your final thoughts and comment on that.
Sure. Like where to begin in that question, I guess, is the real question. So let me start off by saying that in terms of like the 7th, like Pennsylvania being the 7th, I was at a conference several years ago, and we were basically educators from different states, and we were each supposed to present a little bit about our own state. And so I was the Pennsylvania person. And I remember, looking like, where do we stand? And we were number 7 in terms of what I found. And then the guy from Michigan stood up and he goes, well, we're number 7 in terms of, and then the guy from Texas stood up and said, well, we're number 7. And it was pretty obvious that like the big ones you know about, and then there was number 7, and there was a bunch of us that said we were number 7. But I think in terms of where we are headed, so one of the things I think about is if I put this in perspective of the global wine scene and even what I've talked about, I started 8,000 years ago. And then 2,000 years ago, we were in Europe. All right, so they've been making wine for a few more years than we have. And I think that in that period of time, they've learned a little bit about what works best for them. And I think that, here we are, ostensibly about 50 years, maybe closer to 100 now. I'm dating myself, but back from Prohibition, ended in 1939. So really nothing happened. Like the last 50 years, we'll say, is where things really picked up. And we've learned a lot, and I think we have a lot to learn. And I think we have, like the younger generation, which, for a long time, I was the younger generation, and now I'm kind of looking at these young guys going, I need to step out of their way and let them do what they know they need to do to keep this moving forward, because I feel like there's that impetus to move it forward and that interest in actually making something better than what we've got, but working with what we've got. So not like throwing out the Concord. It's a cash cow, to be honest, and we need that. But at the same time, we can do other things just as well. So we've had varieties like Gruner Veltliner and Pinot Gris, and the rosé tonight that Maz has had. It was like one of the top wines, the rosés, in an international competition, and not just one that says it international by name, but truly, one that's based out of London. So it's a phenomenal achievement, I think, for the region. It's made out of Chambourcin, which is a French-American hybrid. So there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot we need to learn. And I feel like we're in a good position to keep going with it and really kind of push that envelope a little bit and see what we can do. So altogether, optimistic about it. I think we're onto something. I think we've got a good region. I mean, I can be hopeful, I guess, is the best I can say about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.